Good afternoon, everybody. George had to lean down to the microphone, and I'm just going to move it down a little bit. There we go. Hopefully, oh, I'm being told don't touch anything. Maybe I'll just move. Should I just speak here? Okay, perfect. All right, so welcome everybody to the conference, and we're so glad that we were able to hold something in person. Nice to have people in the room. Please do continue to enjoy your lunch. Please feel free during this session as well. If you have a question, we're more than happy to take it while Darrell is presenting the Journalism by the Numbers polling that we have this year. We'll also have a Q&A at the end. Either way, hold on to your questions or ask them as you wish. We definitely want your participation. Before we actually begin, I want to thank Easy Live again for powering the live stream today, which is available on the RTDNA website. And I want to thank everybody for joining virtually. It's great to have an in-person event, but you know what? Sometimes taking a day or two away from our very, very busy lives, et cetera, is difficult. It's always nice to have that option to dip in and out and participate from your living room, from your house, from your basement, from your bed, wherever it is that you are. So a little bit more on Easy Live. It's a live view company on a mission to help businesses connect, grow, engage, and monetize their audiences thanks to live production technologies. They offer fully cloud-based visual mixers for switching multiple live inputs, pre-recorded content, graphics, and overlays. Everything is mixed in real time in the cloud to deliver broadcast-grade live feeds. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Darrell Bricker, who's worked with us for many, many years on our Journalism by the Numbers. Darrell Bricker is the CEO of Ipsos, and I'll leave it with Darrell to continue with the Journalism by the Numbers this year and what they tell us about the state of journalism. Darrell.
Thanks a lot, Beatrice. And it's wonderful to be back with you in person for the first time in a while. Actually, this is the opportunity I guess I have to give the acceptance speech for or thank you speech for receiving the Hutton Award from the organization a couple of years ago. So thank you very much for that. Sean Simpson and I were the joint recipients of that from Ipsos, and both of us were stunned, first of all, but really deeply appreciative of the fact that our contribution, a small contribution to this organization and to journalism in general, was recognized. So thank you very much to the RTDNA for that very prestigious award that sits beautifully on my bookcase at home. And by the way, is in my CV now. So trust in the news. Let's spend a couple of minutes talking about that, because the news media has been through an awful lot, not just through the last couple of years, but through the last couple of decades. There's been a lot of transition, but also in terms of how the public regards the news media has been going through a lot of transition. So I'm going to show you some detailed findings, but what I usually like to start off presentations with is just kind of summing it up. If there's something that you need to remember from everything I'm about to show you, this is what I suggest you keep in mind. What are the headlines? What's the survey telling us? So overall trust, as you can see in the top line here, is at a new low at 58%. We've been doing this survey for 8 years, the lowest we've seen it. No platform has been spared. This is the first time in 8 years we've actually seen the number below 60%. It's interesting when you take a look at where the trust decline has taken place. It's in Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Atlantic residents, people who are mid-income, middle age, people with less formal education, and people who tended to vote for the Conservative Party in the last federal election. What we're seeing is that people who used to be maybe a little bit more ideological in the way they look at news are becoming more ideological in the way that they look at news, and people are now picking camps. Because when I show you the data, what you're going to see is that the group that really trusts what the media reports has actually increased, but so has the group that really distrusts what the media reports has increased. So what's happening is not so much that there's been a big movement one way or the other. What we've seen is the increase in these camps that have more definitive views of how they regard the trustworthiness of the media. Now, anybody who, and everybody in this room, I shouldn't say anybody because everybody in this room knows this even better than I do, that this is not a Canadian phenomenon. It is really a Western world phenomenon, but it may be even a phenomenon in many developing markets as well, where people just, their ability to trust what they see is in the predominant media about what's going on just doesn't connect with them, and they're having a hard time trusting it. At least significant enough groups on the extremes, both pro and against. It's almost like if you're pro, like I said before, you're picking your camp. Traditional platforms still have a trust advantage, and this is something Fiona Conway and I looked at when we first started doing these surveys, and George, we talked about for a while. Even if you're the best brand in television news, the best brand in print journalism, your digital platform is not seen as equivalent as your more traditional platform. So for broadcast television news, your websites are not seen as being as trustworthy as your broadcast. And for print journalists, your digital site is not seen as credible as your printed edition. Same thing for radio. So those traditional brands have continue to have strong currency in Canada. Transferring it over to the digital platforms and expecting that it's going to be equivalent hasn't really been the case. It doesn't mean that it's completely down with every other social media site. Obviously, there's something that adheres to the brand from the dominant platform, but it's not as high as what we see in the more traditional space for those platforms. We like local news. There's this old expression, I don't know where it comes from, but it might be Noel Coward or somebody. It's nothing propinque's like propinquity. Propinquity means nearness in space. Things that are closer to you, you value more. Local news is the thing that is closest to people. They value it more. The big question is, how do you value it in a meaningful way? Are you willing to pay for it? And that's where there's a question. There is some social media youth advantage, but I will say when it comes to media in terms of trustworthiness, if you trust things in a more traditional platform, you may trust it less in a digital platform, but you tend to be more trusting than people who aren't. People who don't trust tend to be across the board people who, on both sides of this. So there tends to be a group of people who more or less, regardless of how it is, they're the repository of trust for the media. Social media for youth, obviously there's something going on there. But youth are an interesting group because, and I'll give you a great example of this. I'm going to talk about the trucker protest in a minute because we did ask some questions specifically about that. But the people who were most supportive of the Black Lives movement, Lives Matters movement, and the trucker movement were the same people. Younger people. People who are feeling left out. It was really a reflection of people feeling like they were being left out of the decision making. They were being left out of what was going on. And they, in our surveys, they were shockingly similar groups of people: younger, less educated, more urbanized, people of that nature. So it's a general sense of being aggressive about how things operate, as opposed to being specifically aggressive about one or two things. Just generally upset with everything that's happening and aligning themselves with anything that seems to be pushing back. What we're also seeing in terms of news stories, news content, what people are more interested in. I know Fiona and I have worked on a couple of other studies in which we've looked at this kind of thing. More personal, less political. Is the media biased? Depends on who you ask. Big groups of people saying no, but big groups of people also saying yes. And it depends on the topic. And finally, there's been progress on diversity. I'll show you the numbers here, and you can come to your own conclusion. The conclusion I come to is it looks like progress, except on geography and politics. If you really want to find where people feel discriminated on in Canada, I mean large groups of people, it's on whether or not they believe their political point of view is being well represented in terms of how the media talks about politics, but also in terms of geography. The media feels very central Canadian to people who don't live in central Canada. So, now I give you the footnotes. So how do we come to all these conclusions? Well, here's media going back to 2018 to 2022, the trust numbers. At the top, as you see, 58%, the lowest that we've ever recorded over the space of the time period that we've been doing this. But the age brackets are interesting on this to me. It's not like the young people are completely different. In fact, they're a little bit more trusting than people who are in that middle-aged, middle category I was talking about before, which is where that comes from. Older people are the ones who have the largest levels of trust. And interestingly enough, when it came to the trucker protests, the people who were the most law and order about all of that stuff were the older folks. The people who were most aligned with what the Liberal government did were older folks, not younger people. Declining trust, and this is across all the different media platforms that you can look at, is significant and widespread. So as I said before, nobody got through this last couple of years untouched. So local news source, first time we've asked that one, 51% has the highest level of trust, followed by broadcast TV news, print news, news radio, cable news. And then when you start getting into things like websites, talk radio obviously has gone through a bit of a 5-point decline since 2021. Social media, Facebook has taken a hammering in a lot of stuff that I've been looking at globally in terms of their level of trustworthiness. The effect of what's been going on in terms of the US election and other things has clearly tarnished their brand in terms of trustworthiness. And Twitter. Given the obsession of journalists on Twitter, the number of people who are actually trust anything that's being said there, very small. In fact, only 6%, which is down half from where it was last year. Monthly news consumption. Not the declines in news consumption across platforms. By the way, all of your news organizations do a lot of really detailed, precise data collection on and measurement on the issue of news consumption and what's happening. That's both a combination of people's intentions and what they say they do, but also in terms of your actual activity. I mean, you can look at it in real detail. So I would look at these data as directional rather than as precise, or a substitution for what you're doing, because it's much higher quality than what this is. But I think that what you would not even find in your own data is this pattern, that there's been a general decline across all of the platforms. Biggest decline that we've seen is in broadcast TV news, at least in these data, down 5 points, and also in newspaper websites, down about 7. So as again, I wouldn't treat it as a precise number, it's more of a directional number. There's nobody that's really bouncing up in terms of big support, and that's why I made the comment, no platform has really been unscathed. The issues that matter can have an impact on trust. So has the way that the media has covered these issues added to your trust or added to your distrust? I should say that the two fastest moving issues I've seen and I'll say on a global level, that I've seen in the 30 years that I've been doing research have taken place in the last 2 years. COVID was number one. Went from nothing in January of 2020 to the most important issue facing the world in just about every country that we measured in, it's about 30, in the space of 6 weeks. The next fastest moving issue that I've encountered in the space of the last 30 years that I've been doing this has been inflation, particularly in the developed world. It went from mid-table type of a number, lower level of the table type of number in the summer of last year through the fourth quarter into January, and it's now the number one issue facing the world today. By the way, climate change on that list is about number 10. The war in Ukraine is at about number 8. Now, much higher in places that are close to, obviously, what's going on in Ukraine. But this universal fear about the future of the economy and what's happening right now, people are watching it like a hawk. It's very personal. It's not philosophical. It's not a, kind of a talking point sort of discussion. It's something that you check every day because you're worried about your mortgage, you're worried about your bank loans, you're worried about your job, you're worried about a lot of things. So if you're doing a good job of covering that, and this says the media, people think that it's adding to their trustworthiness, inflation, helping things out in terms of what people are finding when they go to you for information. The Russian invasion in Ukraine, the international media does a good job of covering war and peace, so obviously that's a hot issue. It's doing really pretty well. The discovery of mass graves at residential schools, people were interested in that story, obviously, and the way it was covered had a positive impact on the trustworthiness of the media. Roe versus Wade, slightly more controversial. The evacuation of Afghan interpreters to Canada, slightly more I would say divided. And then as you go down the list, neither helping or not. The federal election last fall and the trucker protest did not seem to add to anybody's support. And when you take a look at the people who were much less trusting on both of those issues, you can see on the trucker protest, it's 2-1. On the federal election last fall, also 2-1 in the extreme categories. Black being the much more trusting, dark red being much less trusting. And then what we did was a bit of an exercise to figure out how people, when they looked at this specific issue of the trucker protest, what did you think? Did you think it was fair, misleading, accurate, biased, one-sided, balanced, propaganda, trustworthy, none of the above? Trustworthy only at 18. But what we did, is, because you can do this with research, is we did a crosstab on people who said that they voted Liberal in the last federal election, and then we looked at the people who voted Conservative in the last federal election. Look at the difference. Now, of course, you might sit back and say, well, the Liberals won the election. True. But the Tories won the popular vote. This is a lot of people who think this. Misleading, biased, one-sided. Interestingly enough, they tend to be more middle-aged and younger. Who are the people who voted older and more fair, balanced, and accurate? Older. They're in that 69% that we got before. Not all of them, just disproportionately. So what I think we're seeing in the data is that there's this group of middle class, particularly prairie-oriented people living in the prairies, middle class, not university graduate students or people who have PhDs or whatever, people who work, probably commute. They live in those places, and they look at the national news media and they say, I have a hard time seeing how this reflects my point of view. You can decide whether that's a good or a bad thing, whether that's a market that you care about, but I can tell you that's the thing that seems to be having the impact on the trustworthiness scores for Canada's media today. By the way, similar phenomena obviously in the United States. So an interesting question. What do you do about that? Is there something to do about that? Is there an opportunity here for somebody? I don't know. Is the news media covering the right issues? Dark blue here, too much. Gray, about right, not enough. Politics, we've had just enough of politics. If I broke out Ontario here, the numbers would probably be even higher. We've had enough, thanks. LGBTQ2S issues, yeah, probably kind of over the line on that one too. There's 20% of the population that says that we're not covering it enough, but almost twice as many say, I'm having some issues with listening to this as much as I'm listening to this. Sports, interestingly enough, there's a lot of people who think that they see too much sports. 3-1. We could break that down by gender, and I think that the numbers are even more extreme. Indigenous issues, not bad, kind of in the middle. Too much, too little. Climate change, we'd like to hear more about climate change. But look at all the things that are down at the bottom of the list. they're all really personal. This is news you can use. This is places that you can, when I go to the media, information that I can incorporate into how I live my life. So if there's anything people say that they want to hear more about, it's about that. So less maybe about what the newsroom is interested in, and maybe a little bit more about what I'm interested in. Local news. Yep, we love local. I think the gathering and delivery of local news is in jeopardy. Yes, almost 60% of us believe that that's the case. Local news has become more important to me since the pandemic. Absolutely. It punched through, 59%. I'm confident in the future of local news in my community. Yeah, people say that they're relatively confident. I don't know why they say that, but that's what they say. I am more engaged in civic local news stories today than I was prior to the pandemic. About half of us say that we are. And I'm willing to pay more for local news coverage than prior to the pandemic. 28% say yes. By the way, that dark blue line that doesn't have a number on it, saying, yeah, I'm absolutely on side. Sign me up today. 3. So the question is, if I'm looking at this as a marketer, I look at that and I see opportunity. How do I square up that sense of value with some way of being compensated for providing the value? So if you're doing research on anything in your local news organization, that's the question I would be focusing on. People like what they get. They see it as relevant and important, even if it's less than it was. But how do you get them to open up their wallets to be able to deal with it? It's a marketing issue. Diverse voices matter, but racism issue is less salient than it was in 2021 for obvious reasons. It's not leading the news the way that it was back in 2021 and 2020. So it's important for me to see and hear from diverse voices in the Canadian news media. Yeah, 71% of us say that that's the case. By the way, on the right-hand side of this, we had, I think it was 120 people who identified as it's about 10% of the population who identified as LGBTQ2S+. So it's enough of a group to be able to maybe make some crosstabs and make some assessments. So it's important for me to see diversity. Canadian news media should be hiring more reporters from different backgrounds. Yeah, still in the 60s, down a bit. The Canadian news media does a good job at covering news stories about issues of racism, discrimination, inclusivity. Not as good as it was, maybe because there's less of it. But still, over 60. The Canadian news media currently reflects the diversity of the Canadian population. Last year, 69. Today, it's 62. Interestingly enough, the BIPOC community, 59%, not far off the general population on that one. And I would like to hear more news stories about issues of racism, discrimination, and inclusivity. General population, no. But specifically among the BIPOC and the LGBTQS+ community, yeah, they'd like to see a little bit more of it. But the mainstream population, not so much, as we saw in previous slides. So it serves a pretty specific market, but as you serve that market, you're also causing issues with the people who are in the more, who are not part of those communities. Canadians see the news media as becoming more diverse. So in general, are we seeing more diversity across genders? 28% saying to us, yeah, we're seeing more than we were. More diversity across race or ethnicity? 38% saying yes. More diversity across sexual identities? Yes, we're seeing more of that. In fact, of quite a few people saying that, about a third of the people that we interviewed. But when we talk about diversity on the political spectrum or more diversity across geography, not so much. So when you think about diversity, yes, there's the ones that seem to get a lot of attention, but there's these two at the bottom that are really interesting. Particularly when you look at the one that says more diversity across political spectrum and more diversity across geography, because those are the ones that represent the declining trust among the demographic groups that I pointed out to you before. They feel that they're just left out. So where to from here? There's a growing trust problem. It's platform agnostic, although there's still a digital discount. It's affecting all of them, but the digital platforms are the ones that are having the hardest time, I would say, at the moment. How do you break up these camps and create more common space? How do you stop this trend towards the polarization? People on both, we can call it the left and right because that's where they were on the bars, but people who are saying, I'm so pro-media, I'm picking that camp and I'm trusting everything that they say. And I don't know as much as they're saying that they actually do trust everything that the media says, but that it's important to trust the media, that they're on the side with the media. And then there's the other group on the other side who's also growing at a more rapid rate than the trusting group, where the people say, I just don't trust anything I see. There's no simple solution to any of this, obviously. It's a complicated mix of offers, competition, technology, consumer preferences, pricing, politics, a whole big ball of wax. There's a lot going on here, but the trend itself is undeniable. The big question on trust, when I tried to sum this up in really a sentence, it's really this. When Canadians come looking, do they find what they want presented in the way that they want it? And the answer to that, too often for too many Canadians these days, is no. So the challenge is, how do you, as I said before, break down those camps and get people more back to a center space and a more accepting and a more trusting space? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to sit here or I'll sit here?
I'm going to sit right here. You can sit right there.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Darrell, for that very, very thorough and interesting presentation. A little bit sad. I feel a little bit sad now. Maybe a little bit depressed about those numbers. Of course, I want to welcome everybody to ask any sorts of questions that they may have, but I'll start off. I think one of the most interesting and striking things to me was the trust, obviously. And I can't say that any one of us thinks it's a surprise. I think we've seen a bit of a trend. The thing that I wonder, though, is obviously the pandemic, the last 2.5 years have been extraordinarily difficult for everybody. These are challenges that I don't think any one of us has faced in our lives to this point. And not only a challenge that each individual in this room has faced, but that we have faced collectively as a city, as a province, as a country, as a world, really. Is this a blip? Is it because we are under so much stress and we are in such different and dire circumstances? Could we optimistically suggest this could be a blip?
No, I don't think it is a blip. And I mean, this basically what a lot of what happened during the course of the pandemic is that some of this stuff was suspended. So if you go back, and I've got more global data on this, and take a look at the media scores, through 2020 in particular, particularly the summertime of 2020, you saw a pretty big increase in terms of people's level of trustworthiness in the media. And the reason was that the media was really focused on the pandemic, and it was almost serving as a public service or a public announcement type facility, because people, when they were watching the news on a daily basis, they were watching all of the data that was coming out from the provincial governments, the municipal governments, and others, reported through the media almost as though they were watching emergency broadcasts. And we saw, actually, it moved up. There was real utility for that information, and it was reported as data rather than as opinion. And at that time, you saw an increase. And by the way, not just in Canada, we saw it worldwide. So now that we're coming out of the pandemic, we're now back to news being reported the way that it's typically reported, which gets us back on the trend that we were on before, which was typically more of decline. So issues that may not necessarily be as engaging or important in my day-to-day life as the pandemic was, but also reported more as opinion as opposed to just, here's the data, make up your mind. Here's what you should do, here's the public health advice. So as we move back more into that format, you see things back on the same trend. And that's what we've seen in a lot of the pandemic data, is that in terms of public opinion, behavior, just about anything you want to take a look at, what happened was that the pandemic was an interruption rather than a change. So it was just an interruption in terms of a trend that was already taking place, and it's just picked up. So for example, city of Toronto, real estate. Well, everybody's leaving the city as a result of the pandemic. No, they were leaving the city as a result of the cost of real estate. The pandemic might have accelerated it a little bit, but it was already happening. So that's another example of the same kind of thing.
Question for the room, just by show of hands. Who's tired? Who's fatigued? Right? With everything, in general. Right?
I'm tired of me, by the way, just so you know.
And I wonder,
I'm sure you are.
I wonder if part of this just has to do with this sort of general malaise. I'm trying to search for that. There was this one article that really resonated with people, and there was one word in it that described our general sense of being. Does anybody remember that word? Thank you, languishing, right. So I think people feel fatigue and they feel this sense of languishing, this idea, I feel that people are sort of turning internally, shutting down. Could that also be why people are turning away from news and are watching less news, consuming less news, according to the slides that you've just presented?
Yeah, I'm prepared to entertain that. I think that that's one way of looking at it. The thing about the pandemic and what we've been through is, to me, it's not like there were stages. And it's some of what's happened with the stages and what it's done to the public consciousness over the space of the last 2.5 years that really stands out. So, when we first got into this, it was in the spring of 2020. Public attitudes about everything from government through to all the institutions went through a pretty dramatic improvement. There was this sense that we were all in this together. Everybody was working to fix things, to get it back on track. Yeah, there were a few anomalies, and there were some things that were happening in the United States and some other things that were issues. But when you go out and ask people in general, they were pretty supportive of government spending to hold people's incomes in place, support for businesses, the focus on doing things like, for example, science and vaccines. So as we got through 2020 and got into 2021, into the summer, particularly as vaccines were coming back on, or coming back in, and particularly in places like Canada where we had access, people were starting to feel pretty good. We saw the general public mood started to improve. So economic confidence improved, government performance scores improved. Most of the things that you would look at to see what the general mood was of the public were headed in a positive direction. And then Omicron hit in September, the fourth quarter of last year, and everything just flattened out and it went down. So what happened was an urgent issue pushed out all the other agenda issues that were dominating all of the public discussion, and that was the pandemic. And then we got into the fall of last year, and we thought we were getting back into those issues again, and then all of a sudden we were back into the pandemic again. Okay, so we're getting the pandemic back on track a little bit now, or actually more than a little bit now, but what's happened is, instead of the important issues starting to come back, another urgent issue has come out, and that's inflation, and people's real depth of concern about the economy. So what's happened is we feel like wrung out towels. That's how we feel right now. We just feel like things were getting better, they got worse, and oh my God, they're getting really, really dire in terms of what I'm worried about in terms of the future economy. So what we saw is things moved up, went back down, inflation started hitting the fourth quarter at the end of last year, and it started to go down, and it hasn't come back. So big issues on the Canadian agenda. We just went through it in the Ontario election. Housing and inflation, which, by the way, I've been doing this for a long time, as I mentioned before. I've never seen both of those issues top the political agenda. It's usually healthcare. It's usually jobs. No, it's those two issues. So we're feeling wrung out. We don't feel that there's any solutions. We're not particularly happy with the federal government's performance. We voted in the provincial government, the Ford government, although we weren't particularly happy with their performance either. But we're in a very, I would say, wrung out frame of mind right now, and very concerned about what the short-term future is going to be. I'll just add one more thing on that, Beatrice. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you all remember that from your second-year sociology course, actually psychology maybe. So at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is making the world a better place, self-actualization. It's a pyramid, right? Making the world a better place. At the bottom is just mere survival, just trying to get by. what's happened through the course of this is our eyes have moved up and down that hierarchy of needs. And where our eyes are in the middle and lower now. Stuff at the top, longer term, making the world a better place, not focused on that. I'm focused on how I'm going to get by over the next short period of time. So if I'm thinking about news, what's the news I can use? It's about that.
And I'd imagine, too, eye-level news, things that are relatively easily digestible, that apply to people's lives. I mean, those are the conversations I have every day. I wanted to bring in a little bit of a discussion around the demographics, because obviously, you know, you do a ton of polling, but you've also written a couple of books, as it turns out. I've got the titles here, The Big Shift and Empty Planet. So when we look at the demographics, when it comes to news consumption, when it comes to what people are concerned about, where do you see that trend going? We know that the older demographic tends to be more trusting of mainstream news sources, and you were saying that many of the, I guess, middle-aged and younger feel that they don't see themselves. What do you see in the future when it comes to news consumption?
I actually, well, just the two most important decades we're going to face in this century, and that's an easy thing to say because I won't be here for the entire century. I love those prognostications that I'm not accountable for, right? 2030, the entire baby boom is going to be 65 years of age or older. That's 8 years from now. 2030. 2040, the entire baby boom is going to be moving into its 80s. The average longevity of a human being these days is basically early 80s. Nobody's preparing for any of this. And by the way, these groups are pretty much silent. Nobody's paying attention to them. Just nobody. I mean, when was the last time you saw a television ad that featured a woman over the age of 60? Or 70? Fastest growing part of the Canadian population is over the age of 80. We now have more people in Canada, and this 2016 was the first year for this, more people above the age of 65 than we have below the age of 15. I mean, we've had an absolute collapse of fertility. Last year in Canada was the lowest rate in history at 1.4. To just replace the population, just the population that's dying, it needs to be 2.1. Everybody is obsessed with youth, but there's gold in them in our hills if you're talking about older people, because they have all the money. They have all the pensions. They have all the houses that you want in all the neighborhoods you would like to live in. But nobody does anything for them. I mean, there's a couple of specific seniors groups, but these people don't necessarily see themselves as old. But they certainly don't feel as connected to things as they could be. Now, they're also the group that trusts you the most. Maybe there's a need to connect with them and maybe mine that source a bit more. But the people who are really the problematic group, I don't think are the younger population. I think it's that middle-aged group of people who are, car commuting suburbanites who just don't feel any of the stuff. They need to figure out, how I'm going to pay for gas that costs me, 40% more now than it did before. Have any tips for me to help me get through that? Are they sitting back worrying about electronic cars and climate change 25 years from now? No. They're worried about trying to get through the next little period of time. It's not that they don't care about it. It's just that the urgent has pushed out the important. And that's where people are. They're feeling like wrung out towels. They're on the edge, and they're not looking forward to the future with any great positive anticipation. So how can the news media help them navigate all of this? Making those connections probably would be some help. And that's why you see things like local mattering. Why does local matter? Well, because that's where I live. Mm-hmm. Right? I live local.
Any questions from out there?
By the way, these are my thoughts. I'm not saying that I'm right.
Ooh, I see hands. I see one by George.
No, I was telling Beatrice before that I was at the one, and George was here, I know, when they started throwing that thing around and the microphone flew out and hit somebody in the head. So be careful.
Go ahead.
I'm interested. We were in the bear pit this morning. They were talking about, we're going to improve content, or inclusivity, diversity, all of that, and that's great. But I've been hearing that for a long, long time, and we keep trying, we keep striving, we're doing pretty well at it. But what I haven't heard is to use to use all of the platforms you have as news people to advertise and, you know, to put up adverts in places where you normally wouldn't have news properties advertised that much, and to say, we are trustworthy. We care, you know, have testimonials. You know, they came back to me 3 times. They made sure they got the story right. As opposed to tonight, the Ukraine again, or tonight, you know, the story you've seen before. You know, just to invest some capital, resources, airtime, not only in our own platforms and the social media, digital, radio, and all of that we have, but in other places, you know, gaming and all of this. Why is there this reluctance to use the mass media? If McDonald's changed their burger or Ford fixed their brakes, they tell everybody about it. You're increasing diversity, you're increasing all of this, but there seems to be a reluctance to hone in on what the problem is and what the perception is.
Well, I wish I could say it was unique to the news media. I mean, we just went through an election here in Ontario in which we had the lowest turnout that we've ever had, at 43%. The political parties are struggling with a way to do it. I can tell you, dealing with commercial clients and just about every sector that we could talk about today, they're struggling with coming up with a way of connecting with consumers and doing the same thing, trying to find different ways and different platforms. It's just the diversity of opportunities can be overwhelming, I think. And then I think that the conversation about diversity, which is, I guess, the other conversation, which is about you know, what you're presenting, so to more diverse types of audience, and how you're presenting, which is also representative of the diversity of those audiences, is something that, you know, for the last 10 years has been something that everybody's been working on, but obviously, as we can see from these data, that there's still you know, a need to make progress on them. And even on the question of diversity, do we have a broad enough definition of diversity? Because if there's some aspects of the political spectrum that don't think that what they're watching is particularly diverse. And there's some parts of this country that don't see themselves represented in what they is reported as being national media. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, across that entire topic. But you know, I can tell you that it's not unique to the media.
Mm-hmm.
My follow-up is more along the lines of diversity, inclusivity, all of those things are great, but what about honesty, integrity, the fact that, you know, how the amount of time we spend trying to get it right, the fact-checking, you know, and so if the main complaint is fake news and we don't trust you, then maybe that's where there should be some resources and capital spent on reestablishing that trust in the same way that you know, that they would set that up in another product if there was mistrust because someone had found a nail in their burger, or, you know, the brakes started to fail or something like that. I mean, it is, at the end of the day, unfortunately, it is a commodity, and there has to be trust in that commodity, and any other industry would focus on that honesty, that integrity. We're not fake news, we get it right. There seems to be a reluctance in the news business to do that.
I wish I could tell you that was true. I think everybody's struggling with it.
I think it's interesting too, sort of this notion of almost like a review system, so to speak, or, you know, stepping people through how it is that we come up with our stories. I think one of the things that I personally feel is that it's very difficult to make everybody happy. Trust is something that's earned, and when people look at what makes them trust you, those factors can be very different for different people. And sometimes I find that trust today isn't actually about the process that you went through, the protocol. It's more about, are you telling that person what fits with their narrative? If you are telling that person what fits with their narrative, maybe they will trust you. I think that's perhaps one of the biggest obstacles that we have right now. I think sometimes it's difficult to have a conversation when you can't agree that the sky is blue. And if you can't start from a common point, it's very difficult to make any sort of progress. Joanne, yes?
Beatrice, you said that's almost exactly what I was going to say, in that I wonder if we're looking at this the wrong way. So when you talk about trust and we talk about trust, we are asking people to trust the facts, the reporting, the news gathering that we are doing that is, as far as we know, to the best of our ability, as close to the truth as possible. But you also said, I wrote down that you said, when you're looking at people who don't trust, that it doesn't reflect my views. That's something completely different. That isn't, I disagree with your facts. That is, that is opinion-based. So I'm just, I'm just wondering if the question about trust is, I'm not criticizing your polling. I realize you've been doing that, but in a sense, and this is the burning question, I think, for journalism in a lot of the world today, if it's the wrong way of looking at the problem, facts versus the opinion.
Yeah, there's something called the fact-value distinction, right? I mean, I remember this from grad school. I'm sure some of you do. The fact-value distinction. If you're a nihilist, you probably say there's, facts are basically your values, right? I mean, it's a fairly nihilistic way of looking at things. I think to a large extent, people are still fairly grounded in things like science. They still do, there's something there, not to speak to everybody. There's always going to be, every type of denier that you can look at. But I watched what science did during the course of the pandemic, particularly at the start of it, and how convincing that was for the vast majority of the population. And it was compelling, and it affected behavior. I mean, there's never been an ideology or a political movement or a religion that was able to shut down the world the way that science did. I mean, it's just that's a fact. It's not a value. It's absolutely true. That's what happened. But that doesn't mean that there weren't people, on the other side of this. And when I think of the diversity of opinion, yeah, there were people who were deniers through that. But what they seemed to do was get a disproportionate weight because they were interesting. Just because that you were interesting doesn't mean that you're necessarily reflective of what the general population, or even a large segment of the population, happened to think. I remember there was this restaurant that closed down. It was a barbecue joint in Etobicoke. Man, oh man, oh man, you'd think that half Toronto was there, and everybody, because every news truck was there. Nobody cared. I mean, nobody thought that that guy had a reasonable case. Yes, there was a small segment of the population did. And if you would have phoned me, I would have told you. I mean, we've done polling on this. We know what the public thinks. That's not what I mean about representing different points of view. That wasn't a different point of view that necessarily needed to be represented. That was represented on the media, I would say, because it was lurid and controversial and confrontational. That's fun. But was it factual? No, not really. I remember doing some radio over that time, and people said, this obviously a lot of people think this. And I said, well, yeah, I think it's, there's what, 3 million people who live in the city of Toronto. You get 1% of them show up at anything, that's a lot of people. But is it representative of the other 99%? No. So I think maybe a little bit of a better balance. The type of diversity that I was talking about in terms of political points of view in the poll seemed to be much bigger than that. In fact, most voters voted for the Conservative Party in the last election campaign, the absolute number, and that those people were disproportionately feeling that the coverage of the truckers, what you think one way or the other is not the point I think that's important here. It's more about whether or not you thought it represented a point of view that was widespread. Yeah, it was a pretty widespread point of view. I mean, I remember when we were doing surveys for Global at the time, we were getting, I remember one question that just hit me like a bricker, like a brick in the head, was that 46% of Canadians said, I may not agree with the tactics of the truckers, but I certainly understand their frustration. I thought, that's almost half. Wow. And who were they? Disproportionately young people who were also feeling really pretty locked down, over it with everything that was happening with the pandemic, worried about their economic futures. They didn't have, public sector jobs in which their biggest worry was about whether or not their ergonomic chair was going to get delivered by Ottawa so they could work at home. These were people who were in precarious economic situations. They may have worked in the hospitality industry, they may have worked as hourly workers or whatever, and they were feeling really, they may have been trying to go to university, school, education. trying to better themselves, and they were really feeling that what the truckers were saying was reflecting their level of frustration, legitimate or not. So those two things were different, but boy, I remember all those news trucks outside that barbecue joint. It was like, you get what, I guess you reap what you sow, right?
Yes, George, yes, we have another question. Go ahead.
Hello. So for some of the results, there were specific percentages for BIPOC and towards LGBTQ plus people. I was just wondering if in your polling you got specific results for newcomers, for immigrants, in the sense of their trust in media or their media consumption here in Canada.
Yeah, they would have to be able to speak English or French fluently enough to be able to participate in the survey. So I would say that we didn't get as accurate a representation of that group as you would like to have. But you know, where do newcomers live? They live in the suburbs. 90% of people who move to this country live in a major urban area. 90%. More than the average Canadian, by the way, which is only about 65. You want to find newcomers? The entry communities for Canada right now are the Toronto suburbs, the Calgary suburbs, the Montreal suburbs, Vancouver suburbs.
I hear homes in Calgary are actually affordable, so that might work well.
Skiing's good too.
A couple of slides struck me, the issues that matter and then the issues perhaps that are covered too much or not enough. So the issues that matter were listed, the first four, I'm not sure if we can bring those up, but otherwise I'll list them. Inflation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the discovery of mass graves at residential schools, and the Roe versus Wade abortion debate. And then it was followed, I think, by climate crisis and the post-COVID transition, the trucker protests, and last fall's federal election. It's interesting that there are some of these, people say that these are the issues that matter, but if you look at what it is we're covering too much of, we're not covering what it seems people are all that interested in. I mean, inflation does have to do with political coverage, but our, you know, people who respond to the, I guess they're not making that connection necessarily. And then we're not covering enough about climate change, but they trust us less when we do cover climate change. So there's a few things that they're a little bit contradictory in my mind, a little bit confusing, and it leaves me wondering, you know, what direction should we take from that?
Okay, so the first question was really about, did the way that this issue was covered make you more trustworthy or less trustworthy of the media who covered it? So on the inflation news you can use that it's related to that issue, yeah, it's helped. The way that the residential schools, they didn't see it as politically biased or anything, that was helpful. It was an issue that people wanted to hear about. War in Ukraine, similarly. But as you move down the list and you get into things like climate change, not so much again. And the reason is maybe because the media puts a higher level of priority on it than the public does today. I'll tell you, the data on climate change is really interesting to me. So here's what we agree on. We agree that it's important, generally. You go out and ask people whether climate change is important. It's important. When we agree that, and this is worldwide, we agree, secondly, that human beings are contributing to it. Our activities as humans contribute to climate change. So, okay. The third thing is somebody should do something about it. Then everything after that is a demolition derby. Nobody agrees on anything. So the problem with climate change, and I think about the covering of climate change, is continuing to bang on about it being a problem and continuing to convince people that it's important is a debate that's already over. Greta is talking about what it's almost like fingernails on a chalkboard. Everybody gets that. The question is, what do you do? What am I supposed to do as an individual? What should I be lobbying for? What should I be changing? How should I be affecting this? Because you've scared the wits out of me, and I believe you're right. So now what should I do? And not so much resourcing has been put into that. It's more into trying to talk about whether or not this is a big issue. People already think it's a big issue. But it's also the problem that we're dealing with right now is, if you go back to 2019, it was a bigger issue, even though we've been through all of these kinds of things. Why? Because our eyes were higher up the hierarchy. Today they're lower down the hierarchy, so we're more focused on other things. So yeah, climate change, we care about it. The way it's covered, it's not giving me any information that I know is going to help me be able to deal with this problem. So gotcha, I'm moving on to other things. That's where the public is these days. By the way, not just in Canada, everywhere.
Any more questions from out there? Yes, right here in the middle. One moment, we're gonna bring you the microphone so we don't bop you in the head with any flying objects.
Well, please apologize my accent. I want to go back a moment to the issue of the social media. I would make a distinction. When you talk of social media as referred to reporting news, I agree 100% that they are overall negative because they distort the facts. For that point, social media definitely are a negative factor in the society. When they deny the evidence, when they contest the science with the hypothesis that only lunatics can accept, yes, that is definitely a negative aspect. I would say that the reason for which the social media sometimes are useful is that, number one, because sometimes they report the sacred cows that the media don't like for a lot of reason to touch. And second, because the opinions that are expressed by this, the news is made of breaking news, facts, etc., and opinion. Well, means that the opinions that are not politically acceptable or, say, accepted but with limit in the social media find a way to express themselves. So, in a sense, social media always existed. We have gone through thousands of years that there was always a kind of information that was not official. The historical records normally refer to what the upper classes thought or liked or disliked. But there were also a large part of the population that had different opinion. So, number one, we cannot abolish social media. Number two, I would say that they are useful because many times they report the ignorance or arrogance of the politician, but sometimes also how conveniently the official media and the social media differ in reporting, appreciation or evaluation or priorities. In other words, there is an officiality in the media, in the official media. And that officiality, in a way, at least for the opinion, limits the things that are brought to the attention of the people. So social media fill up, or at least are able to indicate to the official media that they should think of some aspects of unpleasant situation, unpleasant status quo, unpleasant tendency that should be revised. So I wouldn't say that they are always good, but they could be a fertile land in which we could find some stimulus to regenerate the genuinity, sincerity, and completeness, let us say, of the official media.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I mean, the number of people who are journalists on places like Twitter, I mean, how many columns have we seen generated out of comments? I got quoted out of, I'll put something up on Twitter and people will be dropping it in as quotes and stories all the time. So I think that there is a place for that. But when you look at it as a platform for level of trustworthiness, right at the bottom of the list right now, in terms of how the public treat it.
Absolutely, there's definitely a place for that, and I think it really does give us a sense of what people are thinking.
We're getting the hook.
We are getting the hook,
Yeah.
but I'm taking an extra 15 seconds or something. We have one more question over here. Please go ahead, even if you just yell it out.
Okay, I just had a quick question, kind of a follow-up question with him. I worked as a scientist during vaccine and stuff. I worked as a scientist to develop the antigen test during that time.
He worked as a scientist to develop the antigen test. Go ahead.
I worked as a group. So when you mentioned that, I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see that social media is reducing the role of media? How is social media reducing the mainstream media's trust, especially when it comes to things like vaccines?
Well, I don't, even on places like Twitter or whatever, there's all sorts of places all over the web where these, various groups meet and that kind of thing. But I think social media in many instances, I don't know that it necessarily, it's more of an amplification tool and a gathering tool. People, I don't think people go on social media to a large extent to get their minds changed. They're usually just collecting information to prove a point. I mean, in political campaigns, my experience is it's kind of replaced the campaign conference call. It's the way you basically mobilize your supporters rather than trying to convince people of anything new. And you saw it in terms of level of trustworthiness in the survey, that it's, Twitter, for example, ranks right at the bottom of the list. Doesn't mean that a lot of people, particularly in the media, aren't on Twitter. That's, to me, it's like the unregistered conference call or the unregistered meeting for a lot of reporters and columnists and other people in Canada is trolling Twitter every day. I mean, it's obviously has an impact, but do people think it's a trustworthy source of news? Not generally, and just based on the data. I mean.
One of the things I will say, I think, is one thing I think we all hope for is a higher level of media literacy in society in general, to be able to, we can't stop the deluge of data and content going at people, but what I really wish people had a higher skill level at was to be able to deduce if that material is something that's actually accurate and something that they should be paying attention to. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much to Darrell Bricker and the polling, Journalism by the Numbers.
Thanks.
I've taken almost 3 minutes away from your break. We're going to reconvene in this room at 1:15, where we're going to hear from reporters who've been on the ground covering the crisis in the Ukraine. So please come back 1:15 right here.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.